Hi everyone, my name is Madeline and this is
Serafina.
and we are Young Agitators. So today we are interviewing Chris Thorpe, who's the writer of Victory Condition.
Hiya.
So we want to start off. The first question is just about the concept, because obviously the concept behind Victory Condition is really interesting, quite different, and I just wanted to know your thinking behind that, your process behind choosing that.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of things going on in the show, but I guess conceptually where it came from was I was thinking about a lot of things to do with simulation theory, which is the theory that this is all a computer simulation, which was being talked about quite a lot when I started writing the show, and I didn't want to make a show about that, but what that made me think of was the complexity of the world and how much is actually going on at any one time, and how the world is constantly asking us to be aware, but if you were to ever stop time, as happens in the show for one of the characters, and suddenly actually become aware of the sheer volume of things that were going on, it would be a maddening experience. So I thought about how to get that on stage and to tell a story about someone who's having a really weird day at work. So they walk into the office and suddenly, for whatever reason, time has stopped and they're given the power not only to see other people's thoughts, but to actually appreciate in that stop moment of time exactly how many things are going on in the world. And then I always find it useful to then think in terms of what goes against that, not what's the opposite of that, but what would be interesting to kind of put next to that. So I thought about another character who had a really focused little window of time that we looked at. So in a way, one story is kind of everything and the other one is just a really kind of focused set of thoughts about a single decision. And I'd just seen a picture from the Maidan protests in Ukraine a few years ago, where the Ukrainian government snipers shot quite a few protesters, and there was a picture. I don't think it's a famous picture, it's not one of those iconic news photographs, I think it's a grab from a video feed of a guy taking aim at a bunch of protesters who are a long way away. And I just thought, that's fascinating. I wonder what goes through someone's mind. What do they think they're doing? Because obviously they know what they're doing, what their job is, which is to shoot someone, but they've been ordered to do that, they've been trained to do that. What is going through someone's mind? What function do they think they're fulfilling in terms of a human society by doing that? So there's the very big and then there's the very focused, but even the very focused has got that political dimension. And then I thought, particularly with this theatre, there's a really brilliant opportunity to also think about the frame of theatre and what theatre does and how theatre is able to ask us to think about the world in a really complex way, to actually do a really limited version, because you're only in one room, but of that thing the world does, which is having so many things in it that we can't actually grasp all of them at any one moment. And also the different forms of theatre that have gone in that room where the play is. So what if we take one thing, we set that next to another thing, then we take both those things, which is like the content of the show, those two stories, which are probably, a challenge to grasp when they're both put on stage in front of you anyway, and we put those two things in front of something else, which is something that looks like the setting and the action of a much more normal play, if you like. And I'm not saying normal pejoratively, but a much more conventional play, so a domestic setting and a couple of people living in real time through a very specific set of actions that could be from a completely different story. There's a whole play there in what Sharon and John Joe do and what Vicky's really carefully crafted in that slice of time that could have a completely different story. They could be saying completely different words, and it could be much more about the reality of those two people in that space, which is something that theatre much more often asks us to do. So I guess conceptually, what it's about is taking those initial ideas about the complexity of the world and trying to replicate them in a theatre in a way that also references the kind of things that we're much more trained to expect in a theatre. So I can't do this, but I've always described it as it's a really extreme version of that where you do that, you know what I mean? So it's like a theatrical version of that, but you've got at least two other hands doing two other things as well. So that's, and so the whole thing becomes about when you experience it, how this room that we're in can reflect the complexity of out there, how it can have a live connection with out there that makes us walk into the world after the show and think, there is so much going on that I should care about, but I need to make a series of decisions so that doesn't get so maddening that I'm kind of paralysed. And also, I really like really dense language. It's something I use a lot in my plays, really. Well, I don't really think they're plays, to be honest, but in a lot in the text that I write for performance. So there's an element of what I like to do that really lends itself well to that concept, because also you get this, you know, everything is described in real detail. So even though you might not follow both stories, you know, fully in their, you know, their arc, which is there, there's the moments are what are important, and it does bring you along, you know, in a cumulative kind of experience of their experiences.
What does that mean? Sorry, like you saying that you don't, that maybe not plays but text for performance. What's the difference there? I'm interested in that sentence.
I mean, it's not something that I don't spend too much time thinking about this, to be honest. But what the default way of describing the things that go on stage, particularly in theatres, on the kind of stages that look like the stage here, is a play, and a play suggests a kind of classical form and a narrative form and all those things. And I would say that all those elements are in the stuff that I do, but I'm much more interested in language and the way that carries meaning, but also in, you know, that carries meaning in performance. So there are elements that are really, really close to the elements of conventional playwriting, if you like. And again, I don't say conventional in a kind of pejorative way. I just mean the kind of way that a lot of plays are made. And I guess it's a way of, when I say that I don't write plays, it's a way of foregrounding, maybe, I'm psychologizing myself here, so I don't know if this is even true, but I think it's a way of foregrounding that idea that there are different rules, there can be different rules about how you view and try to encompass the information that's coming at you from the stage and what it's asking you to do. And I think it's a way of kind of saying, just sit here and try and work out the rules with this and let it go, because it doesn't, just let it happen and be with it, because it doesn't necessarily work in the same way you would, what your default expectation would be.
Cool, amazing.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, good, because I don't think I made any sense.
I think so.
Yeah.
So, is there a specific reason for the setting of the stories told by the characters?
I suppose, yeah, I mean, that probably goes back to like the first thing we talked about, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a very specific, like I said, photographic impulse for one of the stories from a photo that I saw.
Yeah.
Although it's interesting how then that becomes something else, because the show never mentions or specifies where that person is, because it's better if you're able to read it as whatever situation is in your head if you're put in a real world situation. So, you know, a lot of people over the past week have said, you know, the people who have gone with that as an idea of someone who was employed by a government to put down a protest have been thinking of kind of Catalonia, which hasn't got that bad, but has been pretty bad. And obviously one of the things that happened just before around the time the play opened was the shooting in Las Vegas. So obviously there are real echoes when you're having a forensic examination of what might be going on in someone's mind when they're shooting someone on a wide space from a high vantage point is inevitably going to be in people's minds as well.
Yeah. And did you choose sort of protests and terror because it's so current?
I chose protests because I think it's always been current. I think things like this have always happened. So it's not trying to make a comment on any particular event, but about why we always get ourselves into this situation, and what that situation encapsulates for me is one of the other things that the show's about, which is the fact that we need an ending. We're kind of almost evolved to need to win, to need an ending, to think that this revolution or this suppression of this revolution or this election or this relationship or this purchase or whatever relationship it has to our lives, big or small, will be the end of something, will be the point that we, that X is finally sorted out for me or for my family or for this country or for the world. And so I suppose that kind of specific moment of violence in a kind of attempt to suppress a rebellion, if you like, is a really good example of the kind of thinking about an ending that never works, because it just becomes part of this cyclical thing that goes on and on. If that kind of thing worked, we'd only need to do it once. But we never need to do anything once, which suggests that this isn't actually a thing that has an end. But we're conditioned to think in big and small ways about winning and about the idea this has an end, and about solving problems that way, and about the end of the world, which is another thing the show is about. It's about how we're conditioned to think about the end of the world, or the end of history, or the end of a political process. And victory condition itself is a term that is taken from gaming, which is that there are two types of game. There are ones that have a victory condition that you can win, and there are ones that don't have a victory condition, that are just worlds that you wander through, that are a constant process of change. And you might be able to win small, bit like quests in that game, but the game itself is not ultimately winnable. And I think it's much more likely that we're living in that kind of world than the one where suddenly we'll get to a point where everything's all right, or the right people have won. We'll never get to that. If we're in that right now, we're in a lot of fucking trouble. So, yeah.
One upsetting thought for a Tuesday. So how does victory condition compare to your other work? Is it very different, or if so, in what way?
I've always tried to find the right form to do the thing that I want to do with each particular show. So there are things it has in common with other things I've written, like the density of the language. There's definitely a strand of stuff that I've done that relies on that really dense language. But there's a different thing in this because it's got that theatrical frame to it. When I've used that dense language before, it's all been about the fact that we're in this room, we're in the theatre, we use microphones, we read the text. And Sam Pritchard, who works here at the Royal Court, did a production of one of my plays a few years ago, which had a similar kind of language to Victory Condition, but the performers read the text through microphones, and it was very still, and there was a little bit of dialogue that they knew, but they were generally just reading. So I guess this is a kind of the same language in a slightly more complicated context. But then I've done stuff that's a million miles away from this. Sometimes you need the intimacy of being able to sit around a table with a bunch of people. There's a poet, Hannah Jane Walker, who I've worked with for years now, who, I've made a couple of shows with her where the audience just sit around a table with us, and the show is as much a conversation as it is the stories and poems that are in the show that we know, but we also ask for material from the audience and weave that into the show. Or we ask them to leave their phones on, and then if they have a phone call during the show, they have it in front of everyone, and that becomes the show. Or you know, working with people like Third Angel, where I might write a text, or we might write a text together that is a composite of loads of different experiences, so it feels really episodic, because that's what we want to say. You know, so it kind of try and fit the actual form of what's going on to the particular question that I can't answer at any one moment. Yeah.
Going from that, I kind of have a side question that's just tingling my brain about the pizza guy.
Mm-hmm.
And you said in previous productions you've had audience members chime in. It's like that was like the only other character apart from Sharon and the partner. Why? I'm just intrigued.
I just really like it. It's just a bit cheeky,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also it's an extra dimension that comes in that expands the kind of reality of what you see.
Mm-hmm.
So to actually order a pizza and have it delivered during a show,
Yeah.
you know, or to make this space that's in front of us connected with us and with the real world in an extra way. So it's another pathway.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's just really fun to, if you're going to do something in real time, and in real time those people order food, then the food has to arrive and they have to eat it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but it's a combination of having a bit of fun with the form of it, but also it's another channel that connects this space to the world outside it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a different person doing that every time as well.
Cool.
It's not an actor who is employed to play the pizza guy,
Yeah.
which would be entirely within the expected frame of what we were seeing. So there's
Mm-hmm.
that little element to it which is unpredictable as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And what you were talking earlier about it being this like composition of things, of idea on idea in a different frame for a different idea, and with that sort of almost like Lego-esque production, how did you find rehearsing that? Like, where were the challenges in rehearsing that? Did you do the text first and like delve into that, and then put it with the action, or the action first, or together? Like, are they inseparable? Interested.
I found the process of rehearsing this really fascinating to watch.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in the room with everyone who was there, with Vicky, with Grace, with Jules, with John Joe, with Sharon, with Dean and Sunita doing stage management. You know, everyone who came in was like actively participating in creating this experience. So it didn't feel like, you know, we come in, we read the play, we block the play, and then we just go through it in order to make that journey better. It kind of felt, this is how it felt to me, because I was kind of altering the language, and we were making like cuts and adjustments as we went on.
Mm.
But the actual process of getting that on stage felt much more like building putting really thin slices of a material kind of next to each other and building up a kind of composite.
Mm.
Because I think with a text like that and the action that it's got to have with it and alongside it, you can't really, because the text and the action aren't related to each other, or not consciously, then you need to build that moment by moment.
Mm.
So you can't say, we're going to have an hour of action and we're going to work that out, and then we're just going to drop this text on top of it. And you can't say we need to work out how to really clearly perform this text and then kind of put it on top, or find the action underneath it. What you have to do is make both at the same time and kind of build up this. It's like putting, I'm just making up kind of stuff now, but it's like putting layers of paint on something maybe.
Yeah.
And you know, something's been painted so many times, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. So you have to keep going back, and you keep having to wait till, it's quite a good analogy this actually. You keep having to wait till the previous layer is dry before you put another one on. Or all the edges of everything are going to get really messy and it's all going to bleed in. So it really felt like that. I mean, if you ask Vicky, it might be, from a director's perspective, it might be completely different, but that's how it felt to me. And that was really beautiful thing to watch a group of people engaged in the process of doing that. It was just insanely complicated. Yeah. But at the end, what you're left with is a clarity of the way that both those things, I'm saying, are kind of working together. That I think you couldn't get any other way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there was no music in Victory Condition.
There was not.
And I wonder why you did that, decided to do that. What was the purpose of that?
I mean, that's, if Gareth Fry had wanted to put music in it, in the same way as if Lizzie had wanted to put like a disco ball and flashing lights in, or Chloe had wanted to make the whole thing kind of go upside down at one point, I wouldn't have, I mean, they would have needed to justify those choices, obviously, and they would have had brilliant justifications because they, you know, that's what they do.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, that was a kind of agreed choice, but it feels to me like that's an extra layer. There is music. There's music at the start.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So we use the North Korean national anthem.
Right. Okay. I was wondering what it sounded really
which is which feels kind of, it sets up a completely different expectation of what you're about to see. But it also has that idea contained in it, because it's one of those really martial sounding national anthems where it has that idea that this is we've come together for a theatre performance, and this is the bit where we all stand up and we pay reverence to the idea of the theatre, and then obviously the blinds go and it's just a flat couple of people in it, which I think I really like that.
Yeah.
I've been to places in the world where people stand, you know, they play the national anthem before the show and everyone stands up and then the show starts, and I find it really weird.
Yeah.
So that's just about a weird moment. But music's there, but I suppose that's not really in the show. In the script, it's specified that when they have the pizza, they just sit and eat the pizza, and there's silent. They don't talk to each other, and they listen to Try a Little Tenderness through a really crappy Bluetooth speaker on stage. They just stream some music, which felt like that came in pretty late, because obviously that's a really conscious reference to Road and to that amazing scene in Road where they listen to Try a Little Tenderness. But there's something about the crappiness of kind of trying to replicate that with really just the kind of equipment that we all have in our houses that is meant to kind of create a profound experience. And it felt like that was too much of a comment on like the way we listen to music now. And it could also be read as kind of an ironic comment on Road, which it absolutely isn't. Because that's one of the most powerful moments in theatre for me, that scene in Road. And we felt like it could be read as kind of taking a piss out of that in an unuseful way.
Yeah.
But also when it's about something different. So there would have been music there, and it went. But also I think there's an extra layer that music gives it. There's a kind of almost using music in something like this is telling the audience when this is there is music in it, I would say, because in the final, it's really kind of subtle, but certainly in the final few minutes, Gareth does this amazing underscore.
It's like a hum.
Yeah, a kind of hum, but it then gets these kind of tonal qualities to it, and it kind of brings you out of your seat like that.
Yeah.
But what that does is it doesn't give you so much an emotional kind of guide, but it says this is just focus. We're getting to where all this kind of at least seems to come together. And Lizzie does a similar thing with the lights. It's very, very subtle, and it kind of brings you in. Yeah. But I've got I have terrible ideas about sound, and I have all the ideas that I have about the textures of things in that way in rehearsal rooms that generally don't make it into the show. Yeah. Apart from maybe the North Korean national anthem in this one. Because if you left it to me, the show would be littered with signposts that said, this is a great piece of music, let's all just sit and listen to this, or this is how we should maybe feel right now, or stuff. And actually the job, quite often, of the other people in the room is to say to the writer, no, the text is doing that. I wanted to put a line in at one point where it really reiterated there's a bit of John Joe's thing where he talks about the dream that he imagines the woman that he's watching having. And I wanted to put an extra line in that said, and in the, you know, reiterate that this was still within that dream.
Mm-hmm.
And like the feeling was no, you know, if it was like, no, don't be, the text does that job. You're being slightly worried when you're saying that you haven't put enough in that people can get. And I think I do the same thing with music.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What would you have had, if it was a song, if this play was a song, what would it be? Called it a play then, didn't it?
You mean the 3 different parts all together?
Just all together. If watching it, I mean, I don't know whether you liked it or hated it or whatever, which is totally fine. But if it was a song,
I think
what would be
for me it would be like something like from Panic at the Disco's first album.
Right.
It reminded me really heavily of my like adolescent solipsistic crisis.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. I'm glad to know that at the age I'm at, I'm writing things that connect with your remembrance of your adolescence. God, I just haven't grown up, have I, in any way. How about you?
Now that you've said that, I'm thinking, yeah, I see that because when they, like, those kind of songs, it's sort of like, oh, she doesn't love me, but also fuck the system and stuff like
Let's
that.
get drunk and punch something.
Right, that's interesting.
So yeah, that like relationships and family and the world and outside like space, because people just, yeah, it's everything all at once, which is...
So one of those songs that's about a kind of big, kind of emotional,
yeah,
like a rejecting experience of the kind of frameworks of things.
yeah, or just everything going wrong, but...
Maybe some Adele then.
Maybe some Adele.
There we go.
That'd be brilliant.
Yeah.
Should have ended with, what's that Adele song?
Someone like
Hello.
Hello.
Should have
Yeah.
ended with hello. This is why I don't use songs in place, because I would have totally gone after this conversation, yeah, we should totally just end it with hello by Adele. It's weird because for me it's a bit, and maybe it's the kind of stage of life that you're at, the stage of life that I'm at, or maybe it's because I think about, maybe I'm giving, maybe you fucking nailed it and that's what the show's about actually. You know, those feelings, but also for me it's about like there's a guy called Moondog who makes really sort of complicated, he was like a street artist. He used to just play on the street and then someone found him and recorded him. He makes really complicated but simple rhythms that kind of phase in and out of each other.
Yeah.
And there isn't really an emotional content to that for me, but I like the idea of it being one of those massive songs where just the world is fucked as well. Yeah, maybe it's both. But that's it. And if we were to choose a song, this music question is really interesting actually, because if we were to choose a song, that's 3 very different types of songs. One very specific band, one kind of song, and one thing that's more about a totally different quality of music that we've all come up with. And if one of us had to make that decision, then the other 2 don't get to see the things that they see in the show, or feel the things that they feel. Do you see what I mean?
Play them all at the same time, like every song ever written.
Well, the other idea, which didn't make it into the show, which Gareth probably, I don't even know if Vicky told Gareth, but I certainly didn't, was there would be a constant soundtrack in the show, but it would be a really recognisable, naturalistic soundtrack of a place that we weren't looking at.
Yeah, I was thinking that like another the music would be another
Yeah.
place and time.
So like a warehouse or a lift or a factory or something like that.
Yeah.
Something which was, you listened to it and went, oh yeah, I know exactly what that is, but it can't be any of the things that I'm either hearing about or watching. But it feels like, this show asks people to do enough kind of
Yeah,
enough
there's a
of
lot of
that.
layers.
Yeah.
Did you ever read that book Flatland about the shape that gets taken into the next dimension?
Yeah.
Oh my god, I feel like that's what it's starting to feel like for me, where it's like I've been taken into both to places with less dimensions and places with more, and I can't explain it to anyone.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I love that book. Love that book.
Yeah, I used to read that and listen to Panic at the Disco.
So it's an interracial couple. Does that have anything to do with it? Was there a reason why it was a woman telling the story of stopping time and simulation theory, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the male character was a sniper, anything, or just casting, was just how the cookie crumbled.
I mean, there's a whole load of things there, isn't there? I am aware that in this show, the woman is telling the story about having the big kind of, and the man's telling the story about focus and violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm aware that in a way, that's kind of as expected. If you were to assign a gender to each of those stories, you know, if it was a binary, if we're talking a binary gender world, one of them had to be male, one of them had to be female, that's the way you would do it. I think it needs that in terms of, because the show isn't there to, the show needs those entry points into it to be kind of simple in terms of, you can't be thinking about the gender thing too much, will you? Also, I think there's things that go against that. You know, if you're going to look at it in stereotypical terms, he actually has a much more complex emotional world than we're trained to expect that someone who does his job has, and she, out of the two of them, is the technical expert, and she's the scientific one, and she's so you can argue that it goes against that and it reinforces certain things. In terms of your observation that it's an interracial couple, there's no that's just because they're the actors that I'm really digging working with. There's no in a way, I think it'd be amazing, I mean, God knows if we'll ever get to this point where we're not in that world, but I would like to live in a world where that is just an irrelevant question.
Yeah.
We're a long way from it. But I guess saying that there's no political agenda to that casting, because there isn't, is at least that's at least, I just wish we didn't even have to have this conversation. You know?
Yeah, I think it's.
But it's necessary to have it. Why did you ask that? Why is that an important observation? Like for your experience?
Just to hear whether there was something or whether there wasn't something. When you said that you didn't have to be a question, I feel like it's a similar thing of there being a victory condition and there being that game that just keeps on going. I don't think there's ever going to be an end to that, personally. But I think it's. I don't know whether it's it being a long way away from that ever being a question, or if that will just always be a question, or always be a thought. But especially for now, just in these times, I just thought I'm going to ask just to see if there was.
Yeah, absolutely. What is it particularly about these times that makes that question pertinent for you?
Roles for black actors.
Oh, so it's a kind of theatre, it's a casting.
Yeah. Just can't. I don't want to be like, it's just casting. But yeah.
No. I don't mean it's just. I mean, it's when you say these times, when you mean these times in theatre, you don't necessarily mean these times in
the world as well. But for this, because the character is playing, the character that she's physically playing and the character that she's speaking are two different people. So we don't know the race of the person who is stop time, but the physical character coming back from holiday, that's a casting thing.
Yeah. There's no kind of narrative agenda in any way about the makeup of that couple. But I think the thing you raise about theatre is a constant kind of. But then there's no conscious kind of. Well, there's no. You've just got to make, as an artist, you've just got to make the choices that you make about your work. And if representation on stage, in however you want to see that, is important to you, then you've got to insist on and you've got to follow through on what you want to see on the stages you work in terms of representation of people. So that's always got to be, for me, something that's present in the decision making. But also, these are the two actors that are just perfect for this show. So I'm not gonna get into a position where I'm suggesting that there was, that one agenda trumps the other.
Yeah.
Cool. And so we are doing a lot of like events and plays and everything based around the current programming season, so including Victory Condition, about the system and about the nuances and changes that we feel like should be made or don't have to be made. And so we just wanted to ask you a couple of questions relating to that, if that's all right. So the first one would be, do you feel that there is an impatience for change at the moment?
An impatience for change? What kind of change?
I think it's just about the want for change in general. So the things that I want changed about the world might be different to the things you want changed about the world and you want changed about the world, or they might be the same, but our priorities are in a different order. So I don't think the question isn't about whether we're like too impatient to have the wage gap change. It's just that are we it kind of really relates back to what you were saying about the Victory Condition, about do you think that there is a sense of impatience of we just need it to be fixed, or whether that is important to have?
I think that sense of urgency and need is really, really vital. I think if there is a difference between you two and me because of we're at different stages in our lives. Hiya. You're trying to come in quietly.
Yeah,
I don't know, I just thought I'd draw attention to it. If there is a difference between us in terms of the stages in our lives, it might be that urgency is, I'm trying to think about it, being an old white guy, is that it's really easy, even when you're trying to be supportive of that really necessary idea for radical change, you've been socialised into a point where you find yourself saying things that are a bit uncomfortably close to, but now I'm older and now that I know how the world works, that actually it's a bit more complicated than that. And I don't think it is more complicated than that. I think that need to change things and change them quickly has got to be at the heart of any effective change. And I can see where that is coming from. I'm not sure if it's particularly, we're doing more of it at the moment than we used to, or whether we just have the means to see it happening more constantly. We have better access, we have that when we didn't used to, where we can just be right at the heart of something. And it's not about saying change isn't possible. If this show is saying that is a cycle, then that is not saying therefore we should give up that fire, because the fire is what gets those tiny changes made, in the context of the whole thing being a cycle. So if we've got a cyclical thing going on, that doesn't mean, if there isn't a victory condition, that we shouldn't be agitating for, advocating for change. It means that the change doesn't happen like that. It doesn't happen like that. There isn't, hopefully, an upwards trajectory to that change in the context of that motion going, you know. And the thing that drives that is the fire and the need for change. So I think that's always happened. I think hope is really important in that happening. I think that there is a natural progression as you get older, that you see that as you might see that as kind of a wider as part of that fire for change is part of a wider context, as part of a wider social context, and you might see it as more complicated in its relationship to the way the world works than you do when you're younger. But I think that developing awareness of the interconnectedness of the desire for sudden and revolutionary change and the world, the larger world, is actually a bad thing. It's a thing you should fight against. You can use it for good or ill. You can use it as you get older in a way that says, so advocating for that kind of change is the province of younger people, and they don't know how the world works, and therefore they will become like me and everything will settle down, and they're, you know, essentially immature for wanting to do that, and we should, and what I've learned in my wisdom getting to this age is we should just do nothing.
Yeah.
We should just, the system will carry on. Or you can say, everything about the change that I want to see in the world at the age I am at started with that. And it's not a process of slowly letting that fire go out. Actually, it's a process of accepting that as you get old, you get progressively less able to move and act, and you stiffen up. So the important thing is to keep that fire right at the fucking heart of it lit, which is about both communication between and across all sorts of divides within people, but also about making a real personal commitment to, you know, even though as you get older you know that you're never going to get as far as you want to get, being committed to constantly at least trying to keep that fucking thing alive. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I've gone a long way around the houses, basically, to saying something that's very similar to, you know, don't get fucking lazy and sound out.
That's really funny because you basically answered our second question, which was, do you think our drive for change weakens as we get older? So.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but it doesn't have to. Is the short answer to that question.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering our questions.
Thanks for asking
Kind of
them.
really interesting.
Well, it's been brilliant to meet both.
Thank you guys. Hope you enjoyed our video. Thank you so much to Chris Thorpe, and we'll see you guys next time.